Well, with only a couple of days to go to the EU referendum, they're telling us that the result is too close to call. Well, I'll call it Remain to win. Ask me this a week ago and I would have said Brexit was a very real possibility. But since some mentalist killed Jo Cox, and since the deplorable, the beneath contempt David Cameron has been stamping all over her death by tweeting out her articles, etc., the polls have now shifted towards Remain. Over the last few weeks, the Remain camp have tried to scare us shitless with stories of what would happen if we left the EU. The stories got steadily more and more unrealistic, and the people were beginning to see right through them. They were simply not believing them, hence the increase in numbers for Brexit. But after the terrible murder of Jo Cox, remaining in the EU has now become not about the so-called experts and what they have to say. Staying in the EU now means that you support the dead MP and all that she stood for. And since her death, if you support the Leave campaign, then there's an undertone that you must somehow support the murderer because he may have shouted Britain first before he killed Jo Cox. I can only call it as I see it, and I'm not saying this murder was a conspiracy, but I am saying that the death of Jo Cox, who was a Remain campaigner, came at the perfect moment for the Remain campaign. It has been a huge boost for their campaign that they themselves cannot deny. Cameron must have been over the moon about the swing in the polls towards Remain, regardless of how it happened. Since Jo Cox's murder, the Remain campaign must have thought Christmas had come early. It might all just be a huge coincidence, but personally I don't believe in coincidences. If we vote to come out of the EU, then the EU is finished. How many other countries will want a referendum on the EU? How many other countries would want to get out of the dictatorial clutches of the EU? The EU has just got too much to lose if we come out. They are genuinely scared of Britain leaving the EU. Then, Jo Cox is killed, just in the nick of time for the Remain campaign. Don't get me wrong, I feel terrible for Jo Cox's family. I truly do. It was horrendous last week. If we vote to stay in the EU, I don't know whether to give up the videos or double down. We'll see how we go, I guess. If we stay in the EU, we cannot ever remove the people who make most of our laws from power. If we don't like the government in our country, then every 5 years we get the chance to remove them. But you can never remove the lawmakers in the EU. They are unelected dictators. There is no democracy in the EU. The MEPs, the members of the European Parliament, and the European Parliament itself is ceremonial. It's advisory. They cannot create laws. Is this really how we want our country to be run? By unelected, faceless bureaucrats that nobody can even name? It's David Cameron's own government policy to pave the way for Turkey to join the EU. Cameron says they won't join until the year 3000. I bet it's more like the year 2020. We do send 300 million each week to the EU. Yes, we get some back, but that money's got strings attached to it. If we vote to remain in, don't you dare moan when our NHS bursts because of the numbers. Don't you dare moan that you can't get a GP appointment for 3 to 4 weeks. Don't you dare moan when your child cannot get a class with less than 40 kids in it and it's your 4th choice school. Don't you dare moan when the EU bans vacuum cleaners, toasters and hairdryers. Don't you dare moan when the EU army provokes Russia into possibly a war in our name. Don't you dare moan when the EU introduce a European-wide tax and exempt themselves. Don't you dare Moan when the EU introduce an internet login for everyone to ensure you're all good little European citizens and not talking bad about the EU, otherwise access to the internet will be withdrawn. Don't you dare! This is what you're voting for if you vote to stay in. You aren't voting for the status quo. I'm not a racist, I'm a realist. I have to say something about Jeremy Corbyn throughout this campaign. What an absolute turncoat and massive disappointment this man has turned out to be. I've said it forever, that we will never get the answers we need from within the establishment. We won't, and Corbyn has proved himself to be a pointless, useless tool for the establishment. What was it? 30 years Corbyn's been fighting against the EU, and when he has a chance to actually achieve something, he falls in line with what his handlers tell him to do, to remain in the EU. Pathetic, Corbyn. Shame on you.